For the last several weeks, we have been in a series of messages that I have chosen to title The Life of Christ. And my goal in this series, in essence, is to direct our focus and our attention on Jesus Christ. We're going to be looking at the parables that he shared. We're going to be looking at the stories of his interactions with his followers and with the religious hypocrites of his day, his interactions even with demonic forces, as well as his interactions with those who are sick, who are labeled as outcasts in his time. And my hope is that by doing that, by focusing our attention on Jesus, that you and I will grow in our understanding and our appreciation of our Savior's character, his compassion and his kindness, his mercy and his grace, his humility, his unflinching obedience to the will of his Father, and of course his unconditional love and mercy and kindness for us. And the reason I'm doing that is really because the Apostle Paul says that our knowledge of Jesus and the depths of his love for us has a direct impact on our spiritual growth and the degree to which we will experience his presence in our lives. This is communicated very clearly, the words of Paul found in the book of Ephesians. This is chapter 3, and this is a prayer that he spoke on behalf of those people. He says, "May you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it's too great to understand fully." Now, because, here's the result, because then you will be made complete. Then you'll be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. Now, I want to read these words to you because I think they're important from the Amplified Version, because this is my hope for you. This is my prayer for you as well. It says, "May you, having been deeply rooted and securely grounded in love, be fully capable of comprehending with all God's people the width, the length, the height, the depth of his love, fully experiencing that amazing, endless love, and that you may come to know practically, through personal experience, the love of Christ, which far surpasses mere knowledge without experience." And again, here's the so that you may be filled up throughout your being to all the fullness of God, so that you may have the richest experience of God's presence in your lives, completely filled and flooded with God himself. And so, according to Paul, as we grow in our understanding of the depths of Christ's love for us, it leads to what he's saying, he's describing here, a practical, personal experience of his life flowing, in and out of us, to the degree that we'll be, as he says, completely filled and flooded with God himself. And so that's the goal of this series. That's my hope and prayer for all of us as we move through these messages together. Okay, so that's a preface here to the series, but today what I want us to look at is a Bible study that should be very familiar to all of you here, probably those of you at home. That is the story of Peter and, of course, Jesus walking on water. The spiritual truth that is often communicated through this story is that in the midst of whatever storm it is that you or I are going through right now, with the proverbial wind and waves raging around us, threatening our safety and security, we need to keep our eyes and our faith fixed on Jesus Christ if we want to stay afloat. In fact, that is actually my message this morning in a nutshell. And it's probably nothing that you've never heard before. In fact, the truths communicated in this story might seem a bit elementary or basic to some of you. But I hope that your familiarity with the story won't cause you to check out or cause you to tune out. Because while I'm sharing something that might seem to be a basic truth of our faith, in my experience, a lot of us lose sight of this truth when we're caught up in a storm, like we are collectively right now. With all the craziness that's going on in the world and the sense of dread and hopelessness and helplessness that's overwhelming the hearts of so many people right now, we, Christians of all people, should be walking fairly steady on the waves of uncertainty as we fix our eyes on Jesus. Well, I'm not seeing a lot of that right now. What I see are many Christians who are absolutely losing their stuff right now. This 9-month storm that we've all been tossed around in is causing many Bible-believing Christians to crack. They're fearful, they're angry, disappointed, hopeless, engaging in knockdown, drag-out fights with their Facebook friends. Of course, there are water walkers among us. I know some of you watching who are faithful, and you recognize that you don't have to get caught up with all the drama and the fear that's out there right now. But you are a rare breed of Christ follower, unfortunately. But my hope is that as we look at the story, that we'll see Jesus more clearly, and that we'll be challenged, and that we're going to be encouraged by his words as he calls both Peter and us to rise above the raging sea, so to speak, as we look to him in faith. So we're going to be in the book of Matthew this morning. And I'm taking a slightly different approach to sharing the story with you as I usually would. As I was going through it, it feels more like a Bible study. Not that I'm against Bible studies, but I'm going to simply read through the story and make comments along the way. It's going to feel as though I'm throwing a kitchen sink at you. So I just pray in the name of Jesus that you'll have the attention necessary to stick with me here. And if you have a pencil or a pen, I would encourage you to take some notes. I believe there are some important truths that we can draw from these verses. So before reading the story, I'm just going to highlight some of the events leading up to this moment when Jesus and Peter are walking on water. And that's because I believe that the events leading up to this event really serve to reveal an aspect of Christ's character that I had known before, but I don't think that I really appreciated it until I studied it this week. But so the story, as I said, is found in Matthew 14, and the chapter begins with Jesus receiving this horrible, heartbreaking news that John the Baptist was executed by Herod. I won't get into it too much, but essentially he was executed. His head was removed, served on a platter. It was just a gruesome, horrible story. Well, you might remember from a message that I shared with you all a few weeks ago that Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. And as I said then, we don't have a whole lot of information about what life was like for Jesus when he was a little kid. But it's not a huge leap of the imagination to think that Jesus and John shared the same kind of relational dynamic that we do with our cousins. If you're like me, I'm sure your cousins were like your siblings. We would play together, we fight with each other, we experience the same painful losses, and at tough times we had each other's back. And I imagine that it was the same for Jesus and his cousin John the Baptist. So when Jesus gets the news of John's death, I'm confident that it was incredibly painful. Remember, we sometimes forget that Jesus was just as human as you and I are. I mean, he wept over the loss of his good friend Lazarus, even though Jesus knew that he himself was the resurrection and the life. I always found that fascinating. Well, here he is now. After hearing that horrible news, he just wants to get away and be by himself. But look what happens. This is Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 14. says, when Jesus had heard about John, he left there privately in a boat and went to a secluded place, but didn't make it there. But when the crowds heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And so when he got to shore, there was this large crowd waiting for him. And he felt this profound compassion for him, and he healed their sick. What I'm trying to get you to see here is that the intent of Jesus was to go and be alone, go and process the loss of his cousin, but in the midst of his own personal pain, I think it's beautiful that Jesus sets aside his own needs in order to meet the needs of others, feeling profound compassion for them. He healed their sick. His focus is always on those who are hurting and those who are in need of healing. Okay, so as the story continues, you kind of get the sense that the disciples are growing tired. This is Matthew 14, verse 15. Okay, that evening, after Jesus is performing all those healings and meeting those needs, that evening, his disciples came to him and said, "It is already very late, and this is a lonely place. Why don't you send the people away? Let them go to the villages to buy food for themselves." It sounds to me like the disciples, they're just done. It's been a long day of ministry, but literally thousands, you'll see here in a minute, thousands of people there gathered, clamoring for the attention of Jesus. And the disciples are probably hungry, and they're ready to grab a bite to eat and then just crash for the night and get some rest. And I also imagine that Jesus was probably just as hungry and exhausted too. But once again, what does Jesus do? Out of care and concern for those people, Jesus says, no, we're going to feed these people, all 5,000 of them. That's what it says. Jesus had everyone sit down on the grass as he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He looked up into heaven, gave thanks to God, and broke the bread into pieces. He then gave it to his disciples, who in turn gave it to the crowds. And everyone ate until they were satisfied, for the food was multiplied in front of their eyes. They picked up the leftovers and filled up 12 baskets full. There were about 5,000 men who were fed. In addition to that, there were many women and children as well. Now, think of how exhausted that you are after feeding 15, 20 people at Thanksgiving. On top of that, I'm going to clean up after folks. Some of you are probably glad that you're only able to have 6 people at your house next week, or not. But I'm going to leave that alone. So anyway, the point being is, if they weren't already tired from a long day of ministry, after feeding more than 5,000 people, you know that they must have been exhausted at this point. And it's here, at this point of exhaustion, where the story of Peter walking on water really begins. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 tells us that at that point, Jesus, he insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. I think the wording here is interesting. It says Jesus insisted. Jesus had to insist that the fellas get in the boat. And as I read that, I wondered if maybe they tried talking Jesus into waiting until morning to set sail, after they got some much needed sleep. Again, imagine how exhausted they were. I don't know much about boating, but this summer, Charlene and I, we went kayaking in Gig Harbor, a really beautiful spot. And, it was cute, but after about an hour and a half of just paddling around, I was ready to get back to shore. It's tiring, especially when you're doing all the rowing, like Charlene was. So, just kidding, kind of. So, how much more would these fellows have they probably would have dreaded the idea of getting in that boat after such a long day. It almost sounds as if they needed some convincing to make this 4 to 5 mile journey across the lake. And I wondered something else. This is a minor point, and this is just me thinking. This is just me. I don't want you to read too much into it. But could it also be that in addition to their physical exhaustion, the reason that the disciples may have needed some prodding to get into the boat is because they could see that a storm was brewing. You got to remember, these guys, at least 4 of them, were fishermen. I imagine they could look and say, that looks like it's about to get crazy, Jesus. We're tired, and please no. But again, Jesus insisted that they get into the boat. And so, anyway, whatever the case may be, they obey the words of Jesus. They head out into the water while Jesus finally slips away. Not so that he can catch some Z's, get some much-needed rest, but so that he can finally be alone to pray. So he continues to stay up while the boys sit out. So verses 23 through 27. After the crowds dispersed, Jesus went up into the hills to pray. And as night fell, he was there praying alone with God. But the disciples, who were now in the middle of the lake, ran into trouble, for their boat was tossed about by the high winds and heavy seas. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the waves. The parallel account of this found in John chapter 6 says that the disciples had rowed about 3 or 4 miles when they saw Jesus walking on the water. I mean, can't think of that. He spent the previous day tirelessly serving the needs of others. After probably being exhausted, I'm sure, from doing that, then he goes off to pray. He doesn't even get any rest. He's praying all night. And then he walks 3 or 4 miles on water to rescue his friends. I mean, what a faithful and selfless Savior we have. When the disciples saw him walking on top of the water, they were terrified, and they screamed, "A ghost!" Then Jesus said, "Be brave and don't be afraid. I am here." This week, as I was studying this passage, I learned something that I had never noticed before. And that's because I'd never taken the time to actually look at these verses in the original Greek language that the New Testament was written in. But here in verse 27, this statement here, "Be brave and don't be afraid, I am here." In the original language, Jesus simply says, "I am." He says, it's called predicate nominative. I had to do a study on what that means. I don't even know what predicate nominative, it doesn't matter really, but what he actually says is, "Be brave, don't be afraid, I am." What this is alluding to, if you don't see it, is the deity of Jesus. If you remember, I am is the name that God himself used to introduce himself to Moses and, of course, Israel. God is the great I am. And here in this passage is one of the 3 times when Jesus identifies himself that way. One time is when he says to the Pharisees, "Before Abraham was, I am." Also, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus and they say, "Are you him that we're looking for?" He says, "I am," and they get smoked and they all fall back. Those 3 times is when they don't have what is this predicate nominative. It's just I am. And it's no small thing. In the Old Testament, Job describes God this way. This is Job chapter 9, verse 8. It says, "He alone, God alone, spreads out the heavens. He walks on the waves of the sea." As Jesus walks on the water, he is demonstrating that he is God in the flesh. 31 through 33, and we're beginning to wrap this up. So, "Be brave and don't be afraid. I am." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "Yes," "Come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately stretched out his hand. Don't lose sight of that. I mean, immediately, there's proximity here. It's not like Jesus was far off. As soon as he started sinking, Jesus was right there, immediately there to grab him. Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and lifted him up and said, "What little faith you have. Why would you let doubt win?" And the very moment they both stepped into the boat, the raging wind ceased. Then all the disciples crouched down before him and worshiped Jesus. And they said in adoration, "You are truly the Son of God." And that's the end of the story. It's only after, unfortunately, after Jesus calmed the storm that the disciples worshiped him. And we tend to do the same thing. And what keeps us from praising God and trusting him in the midst of the storm, as Jesus points out, it's our unbelief. Peter had an initial faith, even though it was just a seed. I mean, if it's you, let me come out in the water. So it was still some doubt in that, but hey, it was enough to get him out to walk on water. But it was him taking Jesus at his word, saying, "Don't be afraid. Come to me." Him standing on that word from Jesus enabled him to stand on the dark waves beneath him. He took Jesus at his word, and because he did that, he was able to walk on water. Of course, as soon as he lost sight of Jesus and allowed the wind and the waves to draw his attention away from the word that Jesus spoke, that fear took over, and he began to sink. Well, the same thing can happen to us in times of trouble. When we forget the words of Jesus, who promised that he'll always be with us. The same words that he spoke to Peter and the fellows in that boat, he's saying them to you and to me in the midst of whatever storm it is that you're going through right now. Be brave. Don't be afraid. I am. Those words are for you. You can cling to those. If you're here this morning, you're going through, or you're there, and you're going through a horrible, terrible storm, you are exhausted. Physically, emotionally, mentally, you are exhausted. And you feel like you're sinking. You need to remember these words of Jesus, that you're not alone, that he's with you in the storm, that he loves you, he can be trusted, and he never grows tired or weary of rescuing you and I from the storms that come our way, even the ones that are created by our own dumb choices. The psalmist says this, "I lift my eyes up toward the mountains. Where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to slip, and your protector will not slumber." Jesus doesn't sleep or slumber. He never gets tired. He is relentless in his rescuing of you and I from the storms of this life. And what I'm seeing so much of right now, and I know you see it too, is people losing their stuff. Christians losing their minds, and it's because we're looking at all the crud around us, and I'm just as guilty of it, man. I am growing quite frustrated and irritated with all of it. And at times when I allow myself to get caught up in that, it's me looking at the wind and the waves that in many ways are out of my control. And I get that sinking feeling because I've taken my eyes off of Jesus Christ. We, as I said at the outset here, of all people, should not be tripping so hard that we're consumed with fear and anger and angst, and I don't care what she says. I'm just going to, have 50 people in my house this time. I mean, look, I get it. And I know this is challenging. But the words of Jesus to us are, be brave. Don't be afraid. I am. Like, does that mean we just sit aside, the pacifists, and casually just watch as the world comes around us? Well, I don't think that's a good thing either. But I also know that one thing we should not be doing is acting like the world does, operating in unbelief, full of fear and anger and rage and hopelessness and helplessness. No. Look, we live in a stormy world. There is waves of financial despair, emotional upheaval, relational issues that you're contending with, personal failures, maybe a bad diagnosis. These things often threaten to capsize us and pull us under. But this is it. As we lift our head and set our eyes on this protector who never slumbers or grows tired, remembering and believing that he is, we'll be able to walk through any storm with hope and courage and faith in the one who is standing with us through it all.